to today's webinar, Building the Capacity of Conservation Professionals to Predict Behavior. I'm Abigail Abrash-Walton, and I'll be moderating today's broadcast. This is part of a series that we present through Antioch University, New England, and the Conservation Psychology Initiative here, New Directions in Conservation Psychology. I'll have more information for you later in the broadcast about the next webinar in this series. It'll be broadcasting next month. But today we are really pleased to have Dr. Kayla Cranston with us to present on this topic of building capacity for conservation professionals to predict behavior. I want to give you a bio background on Dr. Cranston. I've had the pleasure of knowing Kayla for almost 10 years.
Oh my gosh.
I know, it's very shocking, dating all the way back to almost 2008. But, you know, here's the formal presentation about Kayla's background and what she brings to this research, this cutting edge research into today's broadcast. So Dr. Cranston studies and creates tools to evaluate motivation for long-term engagement in environmental projects from a psychological perspective. She earned her doctoral degree here at Antioch University, New England in conservation psychology, her Master of Arts degree in sustainable community development from Prescott College, and her Bachelor of Science degree in behavioral and social psychology from Arizona State University. Dr. Cranston has shared her expertise in conservation psychology by teaching the topic to graduate and undergraduate students at Oregon State University, here at Antioch University, New England, Keene State College, and the University of California, San Diego. She has also facilitated and evaluated trainings to build capacity for conservation in Burundi, Tanzania, and different parts of the United States. She is a member of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas Capacity Development Working Group on Evaluation, and has worked with organizations like the American Museum of Natural History, Human-Wildlife Conflict Collaboration, the Regional Network for Conservation Educators in the Albertine Rift in the Great Lakes region of Africa, Ecologic, and the Tropical Biology Association to apply psychology-based tools and strategies to strengthen and evaluate their international capacity building programs. In her free time, she enjoys rock climbing, yoga, cycling, cross-country skiing, and, as she did yesterday, wrangling horses on her ranch in Montana. So welcome, Kayla, to this webinar, and thank you so much for being with us. I am going to just run through a few housekeeping items for folks before we dive into your formal presentation. Here on the screen, you can see everyone should be connected via audio upon entering this webinar. You don't need to call in by phone, and you are automatically muted by our coordinator, Terry Downing, who is running the behind the scenes on this on today's broadcast. The presentation is being recorded and will be posted to Antioch's website within 1 week. Please submit any questions that you have for Dr. Cranston in the Q&A section. And if you look at the panel that should appear either at the top or the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon with the letters Q&A underneath it. You can click that and send in your questions, which we'll get to later in the presentation. And if you're having any trouble with any aspect of this broadcast, please do use the chat section to message the host directly. And you can find the chat section, again, on that panel. All the way to the right, there are 3 dots with the word more underneath it. If you click on that, you will find the chat function listed. It's also Alt-H on your computer keyboard. So those are the logistics for today, and thank you all so much for joining the broadcast. We will go ahead and dive in, and as you can see, have time for audience questions at the end. Take it away, Kayla.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Abby, very much for that introduction. I realize that a lot of what I was going to say on this first slide you've already mentioned, so I'll try to just touch on the points that I wanted to emphasize for the presentation. But thank you all for being here. I see a lot of you I already know, some of you I don't, and I'm really excited to get to know you in our Q&A session a little bit. But before we do that, I'll just introduce myself a little bit, a couple of things that are important for our presentation today. So again, I'm Kayla Cranston. I'm a postdoctoral scholar in the Human Dimensions Lab within the Fisheries and Wildlife Department at Oregon State University. And as Abby was mentioning, my experience includes training conservation professionals across the world to integrate social science into conservation. And I even see a couple of my students here today, so thank you all for being here. So I work with international organizations to build their own capacity in this area. And a lot of my work is based on the research that I've conducted in North America and East Africa on the most effective training methods to accomplish these goals. So on top of that, I also direct a coaching service for environmental professionals who are interested in applying everything that we'll talk about today directly to their work. So today I'm going to discuss with you what psychological science can actually tell us about how we as trainers can motivate our participants to apply the skills that they've learned from us long after they've left our classrooms or educational events. Okay, so that's it for slide one. So slide two, let's see, goes. Abby.
There's a short delay.
Oh!
You should be seeing it. Do you
Okay.
have slide two now?
No.
It's showing on my screen.
Oh no!
Hold on. Let's see if we can make this work.
This is my favorite part of online things, the technical difficulties that we run into at the very beginning.
Okay, hold on just a moment. Apologies, it should be working. And are you seeing this?
I see it now. Yeah,
awesome.
That works. Cool. Thanks so much, Abby.
Sure.
All right, cool. So everybody, this is slide two. The specific methods and concepts that we're going to talk about today are actually based on the findings of my dissertation research on this topic, which Abby mentioned I completed at Antioch University. And the trainers that I was working with during that research, which I've represented on this slide, include human-wildlife conflict collaboration, which I think nowadays has a different name, but nonetheless, that's what they were named when I was working with them. The Regional Network for Conservation Educators and Researchers, as well as the Tropical Biology Association. So these organizations have many things in common, but one of which was that they created training programs to build the capacity of a diverse set of conservation professionals to apply the new skills, right? So things like GIS or program management or even social science research methods to their work directly. And the idea here is that these are skills that, you know, these folks always wanted to apply to their work, but as conservation professionals, they had not been taught how to do so in their foundational education. So that's where these organizations, played a role. And so the idea was that if the trainers at HWCC or TBA or the network could build the capacity of the professionals that they trained, the expert trainers would not have to be in the room, right? Or be called every time a certain skill set was needed in the future. So this is a basic concept that is often called capacity building in the field of conservation. So as I was studying this topic, this area, this field, I found that what a lot of trainers started to notice in their capacity building trainings was that while many professionals seemed super excited about applying these new concepts during and directly after the training, it was largely unpredictable whether or not the participants who would continue to apply their new skills to their environmental work over time. So this was a problem. The trainers would connect with their alumni months or years or what have you after the training to find out that some had and some had not continued to apply their skills over time. And really they had only collected anecdotal stories about that explained why that might be. So as a quantitative psychologist, I got really excited about this idea, and my research focused then on using the science of psychology to quantifiably determine, with a psychometric survey that I created, what kept training participants motivated over time to apply their skills after a training. So today we're going to discuss the big five psychological dimensions that I found to predict about 34% of the variance in whether or not a professional continued to apply a newly learned skill after a training. So, okay, now on to slide 3, I think it is. So before we dive into my findings, I first just want to start by asking you all to do a little exercise with me. So I want you to think of a time in your life, either as a professional or not, when you were part of a training that went really, really well. This might be easy to think about, might not. What might be easier to think about is a time in which you were a part of a training that went really, really badly. Whether or not you were the trainer or an attendee, we all remember those trainings and sometimes laugh about them later. So can you remember why the experience that went so well really did go so well? And the whole idea here is that I'm asking you to remember something about that experience that went really well, and then also about a training experience that didn't go so well. So take a few moments now and just really remember, and maybe even jot down the details of these experiences. So things like who was teaching, what was the topic, where were you? Were you the trainer? Hopefully not in the bad example, but or were you somebody in the audience? So I'm just going to pause for a few seconds here and let you think about that, the good example and the bad example. Okay. So the whole idea here is that as we move forward through our topic today, what I would like you to consider is those exact experiences that you are all writing down details about right now, hopefully, from your past. And then the idea is to try to remember how the aspects that I described today relate to you and other training participants in the room during that experience. And I'd love to check in with you all about that at the end of the presentation. So be sure to keep that in mind as we're going through here. Okay, on to slide 4 here. Let's see. All right. So on slide 4, which I think I see. Let's see. Yeah, there it is. Okay, very good. So slide 4, we have the basic principle that underlies all of my research on training, which is intrinsic motivation. And this is how I explain intrinsic motivation to many of the environmental professionals that I speak to about this topic. So the way I explain it is that managers and scientists and practitioners of conservation have attempted to encourage human behavior toward conservation goals for quite some time, for decades really, using what many call the traditional carrot or stick method. So either offering individuals an external incentive, like either money or social approval, which I consider to be the carrot, or implementing regulation to deter some action. So this would be the stick. And while these tactics may work to inspire one-time behaviors, and they often do, like attending one training session or applying a new skill a few times, some of the more impactful environmental solutions do require an individual to engage in more than one action over time, like continuing to apply new skills to daily life or professional work. And as humans, I'm sure you all know that applying new skills or even trying to make tiny tweaks to common behaviors in our own life can be very difficult. And even if it is for a purpose that you really value, there are all sorts of roadblocks and setbacks that will inevitably come up during the process of changing behavior, or in this case, applying a new skill of any kind. So unfortunately, decades of psychological research has shown that the carrot or stick tactics will most predictably fail to inspire the kind of steadfast action that is needed to kind of push through these barriers and move on with action towards conservation. Instead, the carrot or stick motivational strategies have often been found to lead individuals to lose steam in their progress over time or revolt unexpectedly against the whole process. some of you may have experienced that in your own practice. So the good news is, of course, that psychological science also tells us that intrinsic motivation is the internal carrot, is what I call it, the internal carrot that pulls us into action, largely regardless of external reward or punishment. And as I mentioned before, I found 5 components of this intrinsic motivation, or like I said, I call it the internal carrot, that universally predict long-term behavior after trainings across North American and East African populations. So it's cross-cultural, which is super cool for any psychologist to find. So that's what we're going to talk about today in the next few slides. So slide 5 is telling us all about the first concept here, which is called meaningful ownership. So meaningful ownership means that individuals are inspired to continue action over time if, and mostly only if, they feel like the skill that they have learned is personally or professionally meaningful to them. So my research found that this type of ownership is increased most dramatically in those folks who were specifically prompted to think about how a topic directly applied to their personal experience or professional interests before the training started. So there are many ways that we can do this as trainers, one of which might include what I did a couple of slides ago, asking you to think about your personal experience with trainings in general. However, if I had more access to information about all of you up front, it would have behooved me to orient the presentation a little bit more around what I already know about that which is personally or professionally meaningful to you. So for instance, trainers in my research that most significantly increased meaningful ownership in their participants were those who spent a lot of time first learning about who their audience was and what was important to them before designing or facilitating an event that brought those aspects to the center of conversation. So when this doesn't happen, the participants often leave a training feeling like they understand the concept conceptually, right? But they're not really sure why that topic matters to them or how it applies to their personal or professional life, which may be similar to the way that I feel when somebody attempts to teach me how to cook, right? Like I know how to boil water conceptually, but not sure how it applies to me directly. So that's just one example. So moving on to slide 6 here, we have effective autonomy. So this is a fun one. So effective autonomy it means that each individual that we are hoping to inspire into long-term action needs to feel like they have gained knowledge that leads to solutions that work, regardless of outside influence or guidance. So essentially the feeling here is, I did it, I got this, right? It's very close to self-efficacy, but a little bit more autonomy in there. And in my research, I found that event facilitators who most significantly increased participants' effective autonomy did so by encouraging those participants to lead discussion and asking those participants for feedback while the event was still in progress. That's the most important piece. The way that when I was teaching at Antioch, applied this in person when I was teaching graduate students there a few years ago, I asked students every class period after class had concluded to think of and anonymously write down for me one thing that they really enjoyed about the class and one thing that they wished was better. I've heard this activity called positive change, and let me tell you, you find out really quickly what works and what doesn't when a room full of educators, right, master's students who are studying education, tell you what's working for them and what's not. So the trick, of course, is to have the students offer this feedback regularly and then alter the curriculum or in some way frame it according to the students' changing needs throughout the course. So this kind of customizable content, as I'm sure you all can imagine, is often difficult for trainers to offer in a traditional training context. So unfortunately, without it, the students often leave the training with many unresolved questions about how to apply the content to their real work. And therefore, they find themselves in need of further guidance after the training, which is what I found in even some of my own students, which are now some of my own coaching clients. So here's the thing. So for these first two, right, so meaningful ownership and effective autonomy, many of the seasoned trainers out there in my audience today may already be familiar with these first two parts, right? Largely either from your own education or your trial and error experience of what works. But the next three that we're going to talk about, the next three components of the internal carrot, I've actually found to be often overlooked by even the most experienced training professionals. So on to slide 7, and what I consider to be the most overlooked piece is this thing that I'm calling explicit community need. And so the idea behind explicit community need, the important thing to remember here is that our personal belief as conservation professionals that an individual or a community or a group of other professionals needs to learn something does not necessarily equate to that individual or group believing that they need to do so, right? So therefore, to inspire long-term action, it is absolutely essential that the individual or the community itself has explicitly asked for that training to occur. So many trainers that I work with often find it difficult to understand why a person would voluntarily come to a training at all or attend an educational event that they did not think that they actually needed, right? So for instance, all of you fine folks out there, it takes a lot of good time and energy to make it to the webinar today, right? So why else would you do that unless you somehow thought that you needed or were interested in the topic? Well, I mean, I know that I wouldn't come to a training unless I felt that I needed it. But here's the deal, is that when I say a statement like that, and I believe it to be true, there are a lot of assumptions that I am making about my audience's culture, context, personal motives, all of that. And when I use the scientific method instead of my assumptions to investigate this type of situation, my research actually found that facilitators that most significantly increase this aspect of participants' internal carrot did so not by assuming, but by explicitly asking those participants about their interests and needs before, way before, even proposing a training event. So in fact, it was really cool to see that the trainings that increase this component, this effective autonomy, or I'm sorry, not effective autonomy, explicit community need, most increased in events where the trainers actually had asked the participants ahead of time in a pre-training survey to tell them what topic they wanted to be trained on, right? So they had little fill in the blank underneath a couple of different options in a multiple choice topic selection. So the people that filled in the fill in the blank, those are the folks who got the most explicit community need out of the training. So now, here's the deal. As professionals, I know that it gets difficult. As facilitators, when we need to consider not only our community's needs, right, but our organizational needs and the goals of our funders and whatnot. And this is about the time when I tell my clients that the most important lesson about this dimension of motivation is that when creating a training or an informational campaign or educational event, you only really need to consider the interests and needs of those who you would like to continue to act in a specific way after you leave, right? So those individuals whose continued action over time is absolutely essential to your project, those are the folks whose interests and needs need to be paramount in your mind when you're deciding about training content. So that is all I have to say right now, at least about this specific dimension. We'll move on to slide 8 now, group efficacy. So here's the thing about group efficacy. The idea is that it's important for individuals to feel effective, not only as individuals, but also as a team. So I love this picture. So essentially the feeling that we are aiming for here is, don't worry guys, I know that the situation is really complex and the application is difficult, but we've got this as a group. So a training is more likely to inspire this durable application of knowledge if it encourages individuals to discuss, learn about, and act on goals together. So how do we do that? My research found that offering a platform or other avenue for communication between participants before and especially afterwards, after the event, was responsible for predicting the highest increase in group efficacy. So in real life trainings, again, this might not be common practice already. However, the good news is that there are many ways that you can do this. Having groups from the same organization show up to your training together, or when that's not possible, being intentional about creating new supportive groups amongst the training participants while you're there. I've also found that pretty much every time that I talk to an audience about a topic that I consider to be my area of expertise, there is almost always somebody in the crowd who understands the concept in an incredibly essential but different way, or is willing to share their wisdom with the rest of the audience about how the topic applies to a context that is more relevant than the context that I'm sharing it in. So the idea here is find a way to use that energy, leverage it during the training, identify who is willing to share their knowledge with others, and if it's culturally appropriate, and that's a big one, be explicit in asking participants to share their contact information with the class for follow-up help, right? So on that note, I saw that there was a spreadsheet that I was given of a couple of people that were coming to this training, and I saw in that spreadsheet that there are many different kinds of experts across the United States and even internationally. So those of you who are education or engagement specialists, those of you who have been in the field for decades or have specific insight about how these concepts apply in particular contexts or populations, I'd love to invite you to start thinking now about how you might want to add to this conversation and help the rest of us apply these concepts in different contexts. So I'll check back with you after the presentation about this. So thanks for thinking about that. Okay, so on to slide 9 here. This is self-regulated understanding. So finally, developing an individual's self-regulated understanding usually means that the individual has to be able to identify and revise a mistake in application of a new skill. So in my research, I found that participants' self-regulated understanding increased the most after events that introduced them to a topic at a level that really aligned with their current understanding of the topic, and then gradually built upon that with new information until they were able to correct their own mistakes in discussion or application. So some circles, more education focused folks call this instructional scaffolding. Others just call it common sense. But the truth is, in real life, it's easy to forget exactly how much legwork this type of thing really requires to create the scaffolding effectively. So in real life, this may look like sending out a pre-training survey, again, to participants to determine where their knowledge base is, and then starting with a presentation of content that begins at that level. So then you show them how to apply the information by having them watch or assist in a demonstration of the new skill or in the new context. And the final move here is to have participants apply that information directly to an application that is meaningful to them, bringing it back to that meaningful ownership piece. And of course, I found a pro move here is to actually have the participants explain what mistakes they made along the way and how they corrected those mistakes to help them kind of become cognizant of that process of self-regulation. So obviously, again, a webinar is not the best medium through which to demonstrate this technique to you. I apologize for that. But if any of you are interested in taking this topic and working with me on this topic at the next level, then maybe joining a group of other viewers out there who are also interested in doing so would work for you. I'll offer my contact information in the next slide, and I'd be thrilled to hear from you on that. So, okay, moving on to slide 10 here. So this is our final slide. And in conclusion, what I want to say is this, that the 5 aspects of the internal carrot that I just talked to you about encourages individuals to engage in the kind of long-term application of skills or action that help create important conservation solutions. And as context and training's goals differ, I don't want you to get stuck on the exact methods that I was talking about today. They were just examples because they will change as the context and the population changes. So the specific methods will change that help long-term motivation, but my hope today is that you will take away from this presentation basically an idea of how to design training events or educational campaigns in a different way. So my hope is that you've learned a little bit more about why long-term application of skill is predicated on meaningful action that is needed by a group of autonomous individuals who can correct their own mistakes and feel effective while working together. So I think that's it for my formal presentation today. Thank you all for listening. If you'd like to learn more about my research or the coaching services that I offer, please do visit my website or email me. I'd love to talk with you. Meanwhile, let's hit it off with some Q&A. I'd love to hear from you now on any comments or questions that you have about the concepts that I just discussed or how they may or may not show up in your work. Yeah, and I think that's about it.
That's wonderful, Kayla. Thank you very much. And I'm looking at the Q&A panel, and I think we've got our first question here. This is from Liz Foote, and Liz is asking, this is also great for those of us who do trainings and workshops. Have you published your findings somewhere yet? I'd love to be able to cite it in grant proposals.
Yes, wouldn't you? So here's the deal. I'm working on that. I literally graduated, I think it was a year and a half ago today. So I'm working on it. I've been kind of focused on the postdoc and working on human well-being indicators with my current work at Oregon State University. And so as I'm working on the next 6 months, we're going to be churning out these publications. And I am really more than willing to send them to you if you would like to, either through me or through Antioch, send your contact information. I'm more than willing to send you a copy of those when they come through. Meanwhile, all of the work that I did was based on, like I mentioned before, decades of psychological research. So if and when you do decide to cite any of this stuff, you're more than welcome to cite me in this presentation. I think you can do that with APA. But the other option, of course, is to just contact me and I can send you the initial, the research that first started that idea, whatever it be, or the different concepts that came together that are already really well researched in the peer-reviewed literature that you can reference. And a lot of what I do in my coaching service with a couple of the folks that are on the call today is doing that, is saying, oh, okay, yes, you need that piece to show your boss that what you're doing is not just kind of off the top of your head. Let me get you that literature. And so I'll send that to them and give them, proper resources for that.
Great. Okay, thank you. And so Liz just wanted to say thanks. She will. And she says she also wants to say a public thank you, Kayla, for being a big part in inspiring her to apply to Antioch's Environmental Studies doctoral program. And she says it's her birthday today, so this webinar is an awesome present for her. Thank you.
Happy birthday,
Happy
Liz.
birthday, Liz.
Oh, that's so great. Yeah, Liz, I'm so glad. Yeah, God, we've had quite the conversation. So I'm really glad that it's helped to move you forward in your work.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Okay, so that was a wonderful question, Liz. And I'm scanning the Q&A box here to see if there are others who are participating today who might want to pose a question. And if you've got a question, here is one. This question is, thank you for looking at the universal approach in trainings. You mentioned doing this work internationally.
Yeah.
Have you worked with environmental professionals of color in the US? And how have you applied the self-regulated understanding, knowing there is a long history with conservation, race, power, and privilege? And I just want to say on that note that we just had a presentation for our environmental studies colloquium on Friday last week from another Antioch alum, Sarika Tandon, who works as an equity consultant. directly addressing the history of racism within the conservation movement in the United States and the implications in terms of power and privilege. So this is a really important area of practice and research. And Caleb, invite your response to that question.
Yeah, God, great question. Great question.
Yes.
So, yes, I did do work. I still do work internationally, and it's a toughie. The reality of the fact is that a lot of the psychological research that I cited, that I ran into, that I used to support my literature review, that supported this, initial ideas that started my research, really were based on research that was done either in the UK or the United States or Canada. And so it was largely based on folks who were doing research with college students in those populations, or, community members that were in those populations. So and were done on populations that were somewhat diverse, because America. I obviously can't speak to that directly. So the idea that I want to share with you here is that I haven't worked with environmental professionals of color in the United States directly, as far as I can remember directly. They were, my training participants that were in the trainings that were, my dissertation research was focused on. Some of them did have different backgrounds, but I wasn't really given that information. The biggest cultural difference that I focused on was the difference between North Americans and East Africans. And the reason that I made it so broad was because they had a lot in common already, because they were conservation professionals that had certain levels of education. And that seemed to be, to me, the most important piece that stood out in my research, was that there are cultural differences. You mentioned self-regulation. A lot of differences were found. The self-regulation was pretty across the board, pretty universal, but the idea here between things like conservation, race, power, privilege, all of that really came up in the first two: the meaningful ownership piece and the effective autonomy piece. And let me tell you why. So in meaningful ownership, what was really interesting was that originally my research was showing me, right, my data was telling me that North American conservation professionals did not need to find the work personally meaningful, right? That they were okay with it just being meaningful to the larger goal of conservation, whatever that be. And that some of the folks who were in similar fields in East Africa, born and raised in the area, they felt that the thing that made it most meaningful to them was if it was professionally or personally meaningful to them personally, right? And so I started looking at this, and at first I was like, oh, that's interesting. North Americans are cool with it being, just about the larger concept of conservation, whereas the East Africans have to have it tied to something more specific that's personal. But the truth is, if we look at the reality of the fact, the North American conservation professionals I was working with were all working for NGOs that had national, or in a lot of the cases, international conservation missions. So everything that had to do with conservation, the big mission of it, was personally meaningful to them, because they were being paid to do that work. So the idea is that it's possible that there's not that big of a difference between what gets people motivated as far as what's meaningful to them, but that it shows up differently in the different behaviors and the way that they say, the different participants talk about it, because of the way that their context is set up, or the way that, history tells us that Americans and UK folks are really more focused on kind of larger international conservation just as a job. A lot of the NGOs are here, whereas a lot of the folks I was working with in East Africa were more focused on the Albertine Rift ecoregion, South Africa region, those places that may have a more personal significance to them. And so I'd love to hear a little follow-up clarification on what exactly you'd like to hear about for the self-regulated understanding. But that piece, the meaningful ownership piece, was really an important difference between the two. And then also what I found was really cool with effective autonomy is that the East African folks really did feel the need to be more autonomous in their work. They needed that. So us as, United States, UK, Canada, conservation professionals moving over into developing countries and saying things like, this is what conservation is, here's how you do it, good luck, is not going to work for them. They don't like being a cog in the wheel. And I can imagine that nobody really does. And again, the only reason that it showed up that in North American or Canadian participants that they were okay with being, cog in the wheel is because they were controlling the wheel. I mean, like America and Canada and the UK is a big powerhouse in conservation. So it makes more sense to me that they would feel okay with being a part of that bigger, less autonomous machine, if you will. So I hope that answers your question. It was a great question. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that self-regulated piece. What exactly?
That's great, Kayla. And I hope that that our participant who posed that question might go into Q&A and offer a little bit more detail on exactly what you're talking about. We have 3 more questions in the queue, and we've got time to address all of them. So I next want to go to a question from Suzanne Macy. And Suzanne says, I have a question about follow-up evaluations after a training event. Do you have a template or a suggestion of how to write these evaluations to best capture the use of the trained skill and the techniques about when and how frequently you follow up?
Yes, I do. So that was the entire point of my dissertation research, was to actually create a psychometric survey instrument that would help people like yourself measure whether or not, or how well you're doing at increasing these 5 aspects, right? So if you're asking if I have a template or suggestions for how to write the evaluation, yes, I have the template of the actual psychometric. It's 30 question survey that I've created and ran through exploratory factor analysis and, all of that. And so hopefully the whole intent was to create something that could be useful to practitioners. So please do shoot me an email. I'd love to talk with you. I can send it to you, or we could. What I've noticed is that because it's such a generalized format, it's much better for me to work directly with the practitioner to kind of customize it to the actual situation. So I'd love to have that conversation with you. And then here, let's see, best way to capture the use of trained skill, the techniques for when and how frequently you follow up. Well, the idea, I guess what I can say is that in my research, we followed up with, so Tropical Biology Association has been going since early 90s. And so we were able to actually kind of section off their alumni into people who took the trainings in the early 90s, people who did it in the early aughts, and then people did it up to whatever 2012, 2013. I think I did this research in 2014. So we wanted at least 1 year. But the idea is that we checked in with all of these people, and they were so amazing to be able to get back to me and actually fill out the survey. And what we found was that the people who, about 34%, like I mentioned, of the long-term behavior that's associated with success in the field of conservation was very much linked to, was predicted by the instrument itself. So we asked them to take the instrument, and then we asked them to tell us about what they've been up to. And I can definitely share that template with you as well, if that's something that's interesting to you. And yeah, and so that's kind of what we did for the research and my dissertation. I was trying to get a larger sense, but of course, if we're talking about specific training projects, obviously the timing is going to look different for each one. So again, unfortunately, what I've learned the most is that the more customizable, the better. So please do get in contact with me. I'd love to talk with you about timing on that, on your specific project.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. So next question comes from Tanya Taranovsky. And Tanya is asking, clearly it helps to have time and resources to put into organizing the trainings to effectively understand and engage the audiences, right? Yes, the trainer hopes to reach. In your experience, is the funding community responding to this need and willing to put more funding into these kinds of outreach efforts? I've seen a trend away from outreach-related funding.
Yeah. Oh, man. I love the funding question. So, of course, I have a different answer now than I did before this year about the way that our funding structure and where the money is all going right now. It seems to be a little bit more funneled into monitoring of things like human well-being and whatnot. So we can kind of put it in there somehow, but yeah, it's more difficult to see people specifically focused on the specific outreach efforts. But the reality of the fact is that I have worked with organizations in the past. Ecologic Development Fund is an organization that I worked with a couple of years ago to directly shape their strategic plans so that they could use these indicators as measures of success for the projects that they funded, right? So I have hope that there are organizations out there that are interested in this. And I think my outlook on it is that if I continue to work with these organizations and they continue to use these, the truth is there's a reason why we do this. It's not just touchy-feely. It's not just because it's right, even though it is often the case that when you're using these techniques, you're also supporting social justice principles. The truth is it works, which means your conservation project is going to have quantifiable indicators of success more on the individual level if you do this stuff, right? And you'll be putting in less funding over time if you are, putting funding into this into the beginning. But I think that's always going to be a conversation that needs to be had between administration and the researchers about where the funding needs to go and whatnot. So, I hope that answers your question. I have also seen that funding is kind of going away from outreach. And so, honestly, I have an optimistic perspective on it. We just reframe it, especially now. Especially in the United States, like what is the better use of our time other than listening to our audience and framing messages of conservation and, all of the climate change stuff around what works for our audience. And I think we've seen recently that we aren't all that great at predicting what that is based on our assumptions and our personal experience. So maybe, science can help us out in trying to figure out what that would look like.
Great. Kayla, so we'll get to the final question that we have, but the person who asked earlier about your experience working with communities of color in the United States did write back to provide some more detail. And the participant writes, thank you for taking time to provide a deeper look. I do wonder if the US-UK professional may have the time to look nationally and internationally versus the East African or communities of color are in a more survival mode due to the daily oppression that occurs in the US. The survival need is more personal. I'm stating this simplistically, but just working to clarify a point. This participant says, please consider looking at the work of Sarah Rebolloso McCullough at UC Davis regarding parallel movements that often occur based on power and privilege.
Absolutely.
And
Gosh.
I can send this out to this participant. I wrote a paper for environmental management a few years ago that looked at these kinds of imbalances in terms of spheres of influence for conservation professionals, and also the kinds of questions that conservation professionals who are in a privileged position can be asking themselves about their engagement in the work. So I'll follow up with you by text on that.
Awesome.
So, Kayla, any thoughts before we go to the next question?
Just the follow-up from, I can't remember, what's Middleton's first name?
I don't see that here.
Okay, Middleton, it is.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for that follow-up, because the truth is, you're absolutely right. And at Antioch, as I'm sure you can imagine, in the interdisciplinary nature of our coursework, we were asked multiple times to consider the power issues, the race issues, the intersectionality of all of that in our research. And, you know, a large part of it was kind of, I wouldn't say avoided, but definitely lessened by the fact that I was working directly with people, potentially like yourselves, who had bachelor's, master's, or doctorates, right? So upper middle class folks in both populations. And so the power struggles, if we're talking just basic socioeconomic level, they were all very similar. But what I'm hearing you say is very important about the fact that East African conservation professionals have a very different life and world to navigate than do North American environmental professionals. And I am so excited in my future work to be continuing to work with people like Abby, who continue to have this level of expertise that as a psychologist kind of is outside of my purview, and that can bring in these wonderful references like you suggested to help me better nest it in the reality of what's happening in the real world. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so there have been a few people who've written in looking for the site for the paper that I mentioned. We'll get that out to you. We also have a question from Jaren Orwig, who asks, do you find that certain conservation topics, for example, climate change, human wildlife, conflict mitigation, and others, require a different training for psychology tactics than others?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, as I was putting together this presentation, I kind of went back and forth about how detail-oriented I wanted to get about the different tactics that were used in the different trainings, because they were all done on some pretty different content. But the truth of the matter is that, yes, of course, the tactics themselves, the actual methods that you use are going to be different, not just based on the content, but based on your population, based on the context, based on who you are, you know, the power difference between you two. I mean, everything. So for instance, in the human wildlife conflict collaboration trainings, it's so interesting because I think that Francine Madden, who's the one that kind of leads up that effort, really understands the power dynamics that occur even in North America when you come in and you know that you're taking a training right next to the director of this funding agency who, you know, might fund you one day. So she actually just has everybody come in nameless. She gives them, you know, pseudonyms or whatever it be. And so nobody knows who the other people in the training are until about halfway through, or I think even at the end of the training, to kind of work with that. And so while my research wasn't directly focused on the power piece, I know that that is one thing that she does that allows for this meaningful ownership and this effective autonomy and all the different pieces of the internal carrot to be more genuine, to kind of avoid those different things. But even past that, the GIS stuff, you know, is obviously going to be taught very differently than the social science research methods. They're going to be in a computer lab for the GIS stuff, but, you know, the social science research methods, I had the participants, you know, break up into small groups and work on actual interview questions that they might use, or survey questions that they might use. But the reality is that as long as you keep these principles in mind as you're creating those, the instructional scaffolding that you need for the self-regulated wisdom or whatever it be, or different parts of the internal carrot, is going to be hopefully the same. And so it's one of those things where that's the reason I created the instrument was to be able to use these concepts across different context where different tactics are going to be used so that we can narrow it down in a very specific context, what works, what doesn't, and how does that show up, you know, in these dimensions.
Great. Okay, good. Thank you, Kayla. So we've got a few more comments here, and I just want to run through them to make sure that we've covered all of them. One question is, can people who didn't register in advance for this webinar, whether they'll be able to access the recording of this webinar later once it's posted? And yes, absolutely. Anyone can. The recordings of these webinars are available on the Antioch website. There's not a firewall that you need to go through based on your participation or your pre-registration. So they're archived there and anyone can access them. And they'll be up, you know, the recording of today's webinar will be up within a week. If all of you did register for today, and just know that you'll get an email from us thanking you for being with us today, but also providing you with the link to that recording. And we'll also put into that outreach email some links to some of the resources that we've been talking about during today's broadcast. So stay tuned for that. And there's another question here, or a comment. The talk you mentioned that happened on Friday about understanding power dynamics would be great as a future webinar. I agree. We'll look into possibly bringing that into this space as a webinar presentation in the future. And we also have a question, which I think, Kayla, you've touched on already, but the question was, seems that these training principles would apply to all topics, not just conservation. True?
True. Sure.
True. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the short answer. The longer answer is, yeah. I mean, as a dissertation student, I'm sure there are some in the audience today that know that your committee is going to make you focus on one specific population, or at least a good committee will, to get you to the point where you can make specific statements about your, you know, sample population and whatnot. So I was very grateful to have to do that, because it allowed me to get deeper into what it actually looks like for conservation professionals. And the truth of the matter is that these are the professionals that I want to work with for the rest of my life in my career. So it was helpful for me to look at this, you know, in conservation specifically. But absolutely, there is a lot of research that shows that these types of things can be applied to a lot of different topics that you're training. And this is really important for folks who are trying to get away from the word conservation. I know in a lot of developing countries, this is a bad word. It's a bad word in Montana. Like I live like 30 miles outside of Yellowstone, and if you say conservation around here, you have to duck because you will be shot. So it's that, right? Like if you don't want to say conservation, but you do want to talk about natural resource management, or we're talking about engagement for more collaborative policy decisions, whatnot, that type of engagement is the type that this specifically works on. So does that answer your question? I hope so.
I hope so too. That actually brings us not only to the end of all the questions that people have posted, and we also had someone post to chat with another resource, a New Yorker piece on conservation, the conservation movement in the US and issues of power and privilege there. And we'll take a look at that and possibly include that in the list of resources that we send out. But we will now turn to bringing our time together to closure, because we really value your time and we're grateful that you've spent the better part of an hour with us. And Kayla, first let me thank you again for being with us today, for presenting your research, for making it so accessible and so directly applicable to folks in terms of how they might incorporate your five big ones, 5 elements of effective training to what they're working on. And I also want to end by saying two things. One, of course, you can find Kayla's dissertation online. It's open access, and you could just do a search for Kayla's name. And I'm sure, Kayla, you probably have it on your website there
It
as
is.
well.
It's
Yep.
under Build Capacity tab on
Yep.
my website.
Great. And then also you can see Kayla's contact details there if you'd like to follow up with her after this broadcast. And before we say goodbye, I want to let people know that the next webinar in this New Directions in Conservation Psychology series will be taking place on Tuesday, November 14th, same time period, noon Eastern time. And our presenter that day is Dr. Louise Chawla. And Louise has just been a tremendous thought leader and researcher in this space. She has been a faculty member for us with our Conservation Psychology Institutes. And the topic that she'll be presenting in about a month's time is focused on social marketing and social movement strategies, making connections. And so I invite you to come back into the same space with us on November 14th to hear that presentation from Louise. Again, it will be an interactive session, and you'll be getting information about how to register for that with the email blast that we'll be sending out to all of you who registered for today, along with the resources that we mentioned and the link to the recording of today's broadcast. So thank you all again. Thank you again, Dr. Kayla Cranston. I love being able to say that.
Thanks, Abby.
And we'll see all of you, I hope, next time for Louise Chawla's webinar presentation. Thanks and goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.